Hello, it's Jacob again, and we'll be picking up where we left off with our discussion of externalities. So, in the last video, I introduced the concept of an externality, that is a benefit or cost that is inflicted on uninvolved third parties. I gave you a little bit of historical context on how environmental economics emerged as a response to the excessive levels of pollution that the Industrial Revolution had caused, and how it demanded new solutions, a new sort of approach to environmental planning that would prioritize moderation by weighing the benefits against the costs of expanding industrial production. And in order to do this, we had to develop a framework for measuring the value of risk, and that became the value of a statistical life. This sort of thought experiment where we ask, what kind of payment would someone have to accept in order for a reasonable person to agree to a risk? Understand, this value of a statistical life, even though we call it the value of a life, it's not placing a monetary value on an actual life, but rather it's placing a monetary value on danger, on the chance of a fatality. Now, let's return to negative externalities. And for now, we'll keep this environmental theming. There are, and we'll discuss some of them. There are negative externalities besides just pollution, but frankly, most meaningful negative externalities that economists are worried about do deal with pollution. So let's suppose that you have a Thneeds factory. I'm sure many of you know what I'm referencing there. You have a Thneeds factory, and the Thneeds factory spews a little bit of smog. And that smog carries with it costs. It causes health damage to the people who breathe it. It makes their environment inherently unpleasant. People are less happy living around it. In general, it's considered costly to those who have to live with it. And it's costly not just to the consumers of the Thneeds, not just to people who buy Thneeds, and not just to the owner of the Thneeds factory, but also to everyone else in the area. Now, in our supply and demand model, we have this supply curve, which shows us the private costs, the costs to the producer, and we have a demand curve, which shows us the private benefits marginally, right? The private benefits of the consumer. But now there is a third party that we haven't previously talked about, and that would be these uninvolved bystanders who are forced to breathe the nasty smog infested air. They bear an additional cost beyond what the producer bears as a consequence of the producer's actions. Now, one thing to note here, I am assuming in this scenario that the producer does not care about the effect they have on others. Simply put, if they care, if they feel the full impact themselves, then it's not an externality because it's not external. If they don't, right, if the pollution does not factor into their own considerations, then it would be an externality. Now, what does this externality do? Well, in a way, the negative externality is almost like a subsidy on the producer. Why do I say that? Well, with a subsidy, the government is footing part of the bill for producing the good. And so it effectively raises supply. In this case, there is no financial payment to the producer. But in some sense, they're not footing the whole bill because they're inflicting damages on other people, and yet they're not being held responsible. The market is allowing them to operate more cheaply than they should be because they're able to offload some of the damage onto other parties. And so, with this negative externality, well, a subsidy results in an inefficiently high level of production, right? And likewise, the negative externality is going to result in an inefficiently high level of production. Because from society's perspective, the efficient equilibrium is the one where social costs and social benefits are equal to each other. Yet, what the market actually does is it weighs private costs against private benefits, resulting in a higher market equilibrium. Now, when you look at this graph on the leftmost side, this shows the distribution of surplus for all three parties. The yellow and orange area is received by the consumer. The blue, or sorry, I don't know why I said blue. The light and dark green area is received by the producer. And then the orange and dark green area is a cost to the bystander, the townsfolk that have to breathe the air. Oh, sorry, and the gray area too. Right? Because for each sneeze that's made, there's a certain amount of smog, and that smog inflicts a certain cost on them. And there's a certain quantity being produced. So this entire area that you see me filling in is a loss to the bystander. Now, when we add consumer surplus and add producer surplus, but take away external benefits, this green and orange area cancels out. It's a gain to the private market, it's a cost to the bystander, and thus on net, it's neither a gain nor a loss to society. But within this gray area, it is a net loss to society. Because in this gray area, the bystander is being hurt, but nobody is benefiting from them being hurt. And thus we consider that to be the deadweight loss. In this area, the social costs exceed the social benefits. And so there is overproduction. There is a misallocation of resources. Now, what would we do about a negative externality? Well, I told you that it's like a subsidy because the producer is being allowed to operate more cheaply than they should. And what is the opposite of a subsidy? Well, the opposite of a subsidy would be a tax. And so what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to tax the producer in order to disincentivize production and get production down to the efficient level. If a negative externality results in too much production, then the proper fix is going to be to implement some policy which reduces production. And when that happens, so suppose you implement a tax, and this tax is going to need to be a levy. We'll want it to be a fixed amount per unit. Usually, a negative externality isn't going to depend on the price of the good. So you wouldn't charge it as a percentage of the price. Instead, you're going to charge an amount that's almost more like the damages it causes. Well, when you introduce this tax, like any tax, it acts as a sort of negative supply shock, moving us to a lower equilibrium. Now, in the previous topic, there was no negative externality. And so the tax came at the expense of efficiency because it resulted in too low of a quantity. Here, the quantity is too high to begin with, and so the tax restores it to the efficient level. And we have a special term for this. We call it a Pigouvian tax, after Pigou, the economist who proposed it. Now, note that even at the efficient quantity, there are still going to be damages. There's still going to be an external cost. However, that external cost is offset by the private gains. In this particular graph, it's offset by private profits and government revenues. Potentially, I believe you probably could draw one where the tax comes at the expense of consumer savings. But yeah, because the quantity is not zero, there are still going to be damages. However, it is assumed that the private market's benefits are in balance with the bystanders' suffering. And if the government had additional concerns about this, they could always allocate some of these tax revenues to a compensation fund for the affected third party. Now, why use a tax and not, say, a price control? Well, there's two reasons. The one that I included in the slide is that a Pigouvian price control would cause a shortage or surplus. With a tax, you move the equilibrium, but you are still at the equilibrium. You're at a new equilibrium, an artificially created equilibrium, but it's an equilibrium nonetheless. If you were to use a floor or ceiling, it would achieve the same goal of reducing the quantity traded, but you would also wind up with unsold goods or slack resources, or probably worse, uh, shortages and lines and some other kind of rationing method. Generally speaking, people prefer to have more predictable markets, and so it's usually better to stay at an equilibrium if you can help it. A second reason why you would not want to use a price control is, remember what I said about how we're constantly having demand and supply shocks. Now, we're not constantly having them on the same products, but all the same, if you were to use a price control, whenever you do have a shock, you would have to update the price control so that you're still at the efficient level. On the other hand, when you're dealing with an externality, it actually doesn't matter if you have a shock. With an externality, as long as the tax continues to be equal in size to the externality, you're going to continue to have a socially efficient equilibrium, even if the private demand and private supply curves shift, because the social curve will also shift with it. So a Pigouvian tax is going to be much more efficient from a practical planning perspective. Now, remember that externalities must be external and unaccounted for. So there is one type of so-called externality that is not actually an externality, but which you'll hear bad economists refer to. Honestly, if an economist calls one of these an externality, then they don't deserve their degree. It's more likely it's someone who had and has a bachelor's in it and they goofed off through their 4 years. Anyways, there are these things called pecuniary externalities that refer to situations where somebody does something in a market and then that affects other people within the market. So, like, for example, if there's a shortage, you often have this with like new video game consoles. They sell out really fast, don't they? If you have a shortage and somebody buys the last one on the shelf and so you don't get it, that is not an externality. Or if you're at an auction and somebody bids higher than you, so they get whatever good or plot of land was being auctioned off, they get it and you don't. That's not an externality. Or if somebody gets a job that you didn't get because they had some other qualification, not an externality. None of those things would count as externalities because you are competing with that person within a market. There was always the option that you could have offered a better price, or you could have shown up earlier to the store, or you could have gone and gotten more qualifications. But you were participating in the market with them. You had control over it. You chose not to spend more resources. Another thing that people will mistake for externalities that are not is situations where there is some cost to the consumer or producer, usually a safety cost, and it does get factored into the price. Um, so for example, something like say a a dangerous job. Like since I've been talking about smoke, let's talk about coal miners. Coal miners often get this condition called black lung. At least back in the day, they would. They're working down in a very dusty mine, like coal dust flakes off of the walls and it fills the air. You always see them in the pictures with black faces and skin from this layer of coal dust that covers every inch of them. And that crap gets down and they breathe it in. It goes into the lungs. It gums up the lung just like cigarette smoke does, and it kills them slowly over the course of a lifetime. It kills them in a much more dramatic and rapid fashion than, say, factory smoke does. But it is still the same basic idea. You're breathing in particles from something that the human body was never meant to breathe. Now, what would make the Thneed factory smoke an externality, but not the coal miners' black lung disease? Well, the difference is that the coal miner knows that when they go to that job, there is a risk that they're going to get sick. And because of that, that is a cost to them of doing this. Because remember, costs don't just include financial costs, they also include other costs as well. And one of them is danger. So that coal miner, they're going to have their own value of a statistical life. And like I've said before, we don't calculate this stuff in our heads, but we do it subconsciously. Subconsciously, we have a sense of if a job is worth doing. And so if a job is more dangerous, there's going to be a lower supply for that job. They'd have to get paid more for that job for it to be worth doing relative to, another job. So the danger, it's not external. It's included within the price. The equilibrium price is going to reflect that. This goes up for the consumer side of things too. If a product causes some kind of harm to the individual, the sins that we talked about with sin taxes, as long as the consumer is aware of that, it's not external because that goes into their demand. You would be expected to have a lower demand for a product that carries some risk to you, some danger to your health, because the benefits from owning or using it are lower. Do understand when I say that. That supposes that people are aware of the danger. Um, you have situations like the one with the cigarette industry where they were just straight up lying. The producers, the tobacco companies, they knew their stuff was dangerous, but they would lie to their customers, put out phony research telling them it wasn't. In a case like that, it's still not exactly an externality, but I mean it's literal fraud, right? It should be illegal. I believe it is illegal, but uh there should have been executions for the tobacco company management. You can't, you know the saying though, you can't put $1 million in jail. Now, like I said, most of the significant negative externalities, the ones that economists really care about, the things that are big enough and common enough and are actually fixable, that we could actually reasonably have a hope of measuring and implementing a tax for. Most of them are going to be issues of pollution. How much crap do you spew into the air? How much crap do you dump into the river? But there are other types as well. One particularly common one is what the law likes to call nuisances. So, noise pollution, light pollution. You can use your imagination, bad odors, anything that could basically get you a lawsuit. You do something that is offensive to your neighbors, and as a consequence, you're you're imposing a cost on them. A lot of risky behaviors, things that cause danger for other people, could count. Speeding is one such. In some sense, now, I mean, if you speed too much, I assume they'll take your license. In some sense, speeding tickets are almost like they're almost like a stealthy way of doing a Pigouvian tax. You present it like it's illegal, but it's more like a chance that you're going to get caught, and it's a chance you're going to have to pay for having gotten caught. If you think about it, do police departments really have an incentive to eliminate speeding, or do they just want to control the amount of speeding? Do they want to collect a certain amount of revenue for the county government, right? See what I mean? Then you got problems like, say, dogs, dangerous dogs. We've got a real issue around here. It's actually worse where I come from, uh, up in Pleasant Hill, Tennessee. But both Clemson and Pleasant Hill, Tennessee, they have a problem with crackers letting their dogs out. Have this big pissed off pit bull. Let it walk around your yard. Don't put a chain on it. Don't put a fence up. Just let the little monster sit out there so that it can chase people. That would be a fine example of a negative externality. There's one I have in mind that I'm kind of hoping to get to shoot one day. So, externalities are pretty simple, right? With the taxes and subsidies behind you, it shouldn't be too hard to pick this up. Now, the flip side of a negative externality would, of course, be a positive externality. Instead of a cost, it's a benefit. You doing something actually makes other people better off. Now, these It's not even so much that they're less common. It's just that they tend to be a lot more trivial. They tend to be a lot more petty. You can probably think of all kinds of examples of external benefits you get from people. Someone plays music in a public park and you like the music they play, right? You benefited from it. So it's an externality. Most of them are small things that don't really matter. They're not a big enough deal for it to be worth it for the state to get involved. But there are a few categories where these things are a lot more prominent. And in particular, it comes up with property and public health measures. So, for example, you think about a typical homeowners association. They're infamous, right? People like to complain about them. Having all these rules. Oh, you've got to paint your house a certain color. Oh, you've got to mow your lawn a certain number of times a month. You can't build this extension. You can't do this. You can't do that. And people whine about them because, well, they want to do something that the homeowners association doesn't want them to do. You say, what business of theirs is it? Well, you know in your heart of hearts what business of theirs it is. They've got to live around you and they've got to look at it. All of your neighbors, their experience of living in that neighborhood depends on your property as well. Nobody wants to look at an eyesore. Nobody wants to look at like some run-down, dilapidated shanty right across from their own nice house. The where the local trash is, they've drug a couch out, they've got garbage strewn all on it. They haven't mowed in 5 months. It's nice to live in a place that's orderly. And of course, because it's nice to live in a place that's orderly, people are willing to pay more for it. There's higher demand for such a place. And so that drives up the property value. And even neighbors who don't personally care may still care because they know that potential customers down the line would care. They want to maximize property value. Well, with positive externalities, the logic of it is going to be a lot like the negative externality. It's just flipped around. So instead of being like a subsidy, it's going to be like a tax. And because of that, we're going to cure it with its opposite, which would be a Pigouvian subsidy. If it's like a tax, we need to subsidize it to cancel it out. And the ultimate example of this might be with vaccination programs. You all know what these things are, I'd hope. It's called the iron lung. People used to get this disease called polio. I think they were getting it as late as the 50s, maybe. It screw you up. Screw up the lungs, kind of like COVID was alleged to do. And you couldn't breathe normally. And the only way to survive once it racked your body was you had to be put in this sort of metal casket with all kinds of doodads and doohickeys poking into you to help to help your body breathe, get air circulating. Once a person catches the disease, there's no hope for you. And I believe it was just recently that the last polio victim died. The last man who lived in an iron lung. And he finally passed away. Well, I told you way back at the start of this topic, we used to live in a world of plague. Epidemic diseases were an everyday part of life. And they would come in regular pulses, and you had different kinds: polio, smallpox, cholera was a particularly terrifying one, bubonic plague, malaria. These illnesses, all the medicine in the world wouldn't fix it. Of course, some of them we figured out, right? You invent quinine, you can cure malaria with quinine. But what really started to turn the battle against epidemic disease was the invention of vaccination. You give someone a mild dose of the illness so that their immune system basically gets to train against it. And then it's all beefed up, it's roided up to take down the real thing when it comes along. I do want to tell y'all, I felt very ambivalent about using vaccines as my example because there's other ones I could use. But don't take this as like some pro COVID vaccine propaganda thing because it's not. I I mean, I just told you I was hesitant to use it. Uh Let me tell you this. Look up children of thalidomide. I'll type that out for you. When you're done with this video, look up children of thalidomide, and that'll explain why I don't particularly trust the FDA. And then look up the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and that'll tell you why I don't particularly trust the US government. Anyways, vaccination protects a person against a disease, but it also has additional benefits in that it protects everyone else from its spread. You hear people like the infamous Typhoid Mary, who she was one of those asymptomatic carriers back in Ellis Island era America. I don't know if she was Gilded Age or Jazz Age, but it's that rough time period, kind of late 1800s, early 1900s. People who, even if they don't need the vaccine because they're healthy or they just won the genetic lottery and they're not susceptible to it, they still act as a vector for it. They still spread it. And because of that, there's an external benefit to everyone of getting vaccinated. Because if the vaccine works, if, then by getting it, that just cuts off another way that they themselves could get it too. Or at least you reduce the likelihood. And this was one of the main arguments for vaccinating the young and healthy during COVID. COVID pretty much targeted two main groups of people: geezers and smokers. Geezers and smokers, as well as people who had compromised immune systems, anyways. So, why would you want to vaccinate everyone? Well, if you're not particularly confident in the quality of your rush job vaccine, if you vaccinate more people, that makes it less likely that the vulnerable are going to be exposed to the disease. Even if the non-vulnerable don't need it, in theory, it's about protecting those who would need it. And we can model this as the social benefits being greater than demand. So it's a very similar story to what we saw with the negative externality. In this case, though, you're getting too little of the product if you leave it up to the market. See, the private market is going to coordinate demand with supply. People are looking out for themselves. If they're not looking out for themselves, if they do care about the bystander, again, it's not external. They have internalized it, literally internalized the concern. But if they're only looking out for themselves, then you're going to get an equilibrium where the marginal private benefits equal the marginal costs. However, there are additional benefits beyond that, because that third party benefits from the extra safety that they receive. For every person they know that's vaccinated, that's one less potential infection And so you sum up over all the different people that they could be infected by that have been vaccinated. So in this case, that area E and G is a benefit. That counts as part of surplus. It's a gain, not a loss to society. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is society's benefits are all the way up here, right? Not down here. And social marginal benefits equal social marginal costs at a higher quantity. And so over this range F and H, there is a little area in which society's marginal benefits are higher than society's marginal costs, and yet trade's not happening. It's as though the consumer is being taxed because the consumer isn't getting to receive the full benefits of what they do. And so they're not doing enough of it. And the market, as a consequence, is inefficient. We have a certain range, a certain area of deadweight loss, unrealized gains from trade. If only we could somehow increase the quantity to the socially efficient level, society would be better off. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, of our various policy failures, there was only one that actually increases the quantity. In this case, a price floor or a price ceiling wouldn't work. Neither would work because both reduce the quantity. A tax isn't going to work. They disincentivize something, you get less of it. If you want to incentivize somebody to do something, you need to reward them. You need to give them a subsidy, a Pigouvian subsidy. Now, I did tell you in the taxes and subsidies lecture that subsidies also have a deadweight loss from the tax you raise to pay for them. So if you're in real life, if you were making this decision, you would have to determine if this is bigger than, the tax deadweight loss. That's something that the textbooks usually won't point out, but this is another reason why I don't take positive externalities very seriously. It's not just that they tend to be more petty, but they also tend to there's no like free lunch. There's no free way to deal with them. They drain the public coffer instead of filling it. Don't worry too much about the middle graph. I include it for anyone that wants to see the full range of effects, but I'm not going to test you on that. So yeah, the Pigouvian subsidy is going to have complex effect, but what it comes down to is that for society, there are unrealized gains from trade without the subsidy. So we have to use the subsidy to correct that. Like I said, public positive externalities mostly come in two forms. They deal with public health, and you can think of safety and security as being like that. Um, things like neighborhood watches, CCTV cameras, alarm systems, things like that provide public positive externalities. If you're afraid to burgle somebody's house or steal their car because you don't know if they might have a some kind of alarm system in it, that provides a benefit to your neighbors. The same could be said of guns. Guns are a little more complicated because they have both negative externalities and positive. If you have more guns on the street, you're going to have more gun fatalities from accidental discharges, from accidents, from dipshits, and from people stealing other people's guns and using them. But at the same time, if you have more guns on the streets, that's also more of a deterrent to a potential criminal. it's not really clear which one wins out. Uh, the main reason why I bring it up is that usually in the gun discourse, gun rights supporters generally all they want is just to have the freedom to own a gun and carry it. But if the positive externalities are larger, if it is true that guns do reduce crime, then economically, there's a perfectly sound argument there that you would want to subsidize them, that the government should actually pay you to buy a gun. That's consistent with like basic undergraduate theory, but I never hear people bring that up. Anyways, I'm getting off into the weeds. But one place where we especially see this is again with beautification projects. So homeowners associations do this with private residences, but in big cities, they'll often have whole districts, right? They have historic preservation laws. They have uh, rules about what you can build, where you can build it. Zoning, right? Zoning is based around the premise that different kinds of businesses interact with each other in different ways. And there are some cities that their very identity depends on keeping a certain kind of look. So, for example, what's this place here? I'm sure some of you in the class must know. Well, that's Rainbow Road down in Charleston. See, did you know that Charleston actually has the world's largest historic preservation district? Probably didn't, did you? But they do. There's a whole story behind it. I'm not going to get into that, but that's one of the advantages of being one of America's oldest cities. Because it's America, being one of the oldest cities means that you're actually a young enough city that people haven't, had time to tear down and replace too many of the buildings. But it's old enough to care, old enough to want to preserve them. And so they have very strict rules on Rainbow Row. You have to keep your house in the style of an old colonial revolutionary era home. You have to keep colors that fit this, rainbow like theme. This one on the left side, I'm sure you recognize that one too. That one is Paris. What do you not see in the Parisian skyline? What makes Paris look so different from other, famous cities? What makes Paris so different from London? It's the lack of skyscrapers, isn't it? They actually have a law in Paris that you're not allowed to build a building taller than a certain height because they don't want skyscrapers overshadowing them, and they don't want anything to overshadow the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower sucks. It looks like an oil derrick to me, but they're proud of that thing because for a brief while that was like one of the biggest structures in the world. See, the thing about historical preservation is oftentimes the value, again, the value of a property depends on the properties that it's located near. But there is an incentive people face to kind of cheat and change a property at the expense of their neighbors. So, for example, if you say you graduate from Clemson and you become a real estate developer and you want to open an apartment in downtown Charleston, and there's really not much land, right? Every spare bit of it has been filled with something. So you got to tear something down. And your idea is, I want to build a high rise. I want to build a 10-story high rise right on Rainbow Row because I can fit in a lot of tenants if I just make the building taller. Now, people are not going to be willing to pay as much to live on Rainbow Row. Their property values are going to fall, the rents are going to fall if you put in this high rise, because it's going to make the street a little bit uglier. You've introduced something that's out of place. You've disturbed the tranquility, the theming of it. But for you as the private real estate developer, that can still be worth it. Even though the individual rents might go down, all the extra quantity, all the extra capacity could easily more than offset that loss. But that does nothing for the other tenants nearby. That does nothing for the other buildings owners. And then, other people face the same incentive, especially because the historic district, it's already a little worse. So it doesn't do as much damage to, worsen it some more. There's already one big, ugly high rise. Why not have a second one? And the problem gets worse. You can get this sort of cycle where a whole area gets developed and it just completely ruins the place. And the funny thing is, each individual developer is doing the logical thing for themselves, but collectively they can run the value of the street into the ground. Well, that's one of your main rationales for having historical preservation. It is controversial. There's a lot of people who argue that on average it does not raise property values, it actually reduces it. But I just bring that up to say, like with the minimum wage, there's people who argue it's bad, but you see how there is a very strong positive externality. We want people to keep the place a certain way. And one way of dealing with that is to have just a straight up regulation. But another way you can do it, if you're talking about something that's more like a product as opposed to a property, you can reward it through some kind of fund. Maybe we'll pay you to mow your lawn more. Maybe we'll pay you to put an American flag on your door. I noticed that I think it's called Taylor Square that I live near. A lot of people keep American flags on their doors. I don't know if it's just something that like they think is nice or if it's somehow related to if they got a homeowners association that promotes it or what, but you get stuff like that. So this is a little natural stopping point. We'll come back in the next video to talk about what's called coast bargaining, how we might use the market itself instead of a system of taxation to deal with externalities.